Senator Markey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Commonwealth of Massachusetts contains more than 700 metric tons of spent nuclear fuel. Some of that radioactive waste sits in 16 dry casks in row, the remnants of the Yankee atomic plant that stopped operations in 2007. After the Pilgrim Nuclear Power Station completes its decommissioning process, which is set to begin at the end of this month, there will be 61 dry casks full of nuclear fuel sitting in Plymouth, Massachusetts. Dry casks are more secure than spent fuel, spent fuel pools, which are a disaster waiting to happen. That's why I have repeatedly introduced the Dry Cask Storage Act, an effort joined by Senators Gillibrand and Senators Sanders. Mr. Fettus, should we ensure that all decommissioned plants move their spent fuel in dry casks as soon as the fuel has cooled enough to do so?
Yes.
Excellent answer. The Pilgrim decommissioning process and the proposed Nuclear Regulatory Commission decommissioning rule both ignored the need for environmental impact analysis. The nuclear industry is running roughshod over transparency and environmental protections. While the discussion draft of this bill doesn't focus on on-site nuclear waste storage, it builds upon the NRC's refusal to seriously consider the environmental and health concerns of spent fuel. This draft does not address environmental and safety criteria in its proposal for interim storage facilities, and it blocks key parts of the environmental review for Yucca Mountain. Mr. Fettus, shouldn't the environmental and public health impacts of storing nuclear waste be at the forefront of our considerations?
Yes.
Now, the Pilgrim decommissioning plan, as presented to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, assumes that all spent fuel will be fully removed from the site by 2062. That's the date being used for all cost estimates. So if that deadline isn't met, and the decommissioning process will break its budget, potentially leaving the towns to foot the bill. Mr. Fettus, how likely is it that the spent fuel from Pilgrim would be moved to Yucca Mountain by 2062?
I think it's very unlikely that it'll be moved to Yucca Mountain, because I would suggest it's never going to be moved to Yucca Mountain for the reasons Senator Cortez Masto and Rosen outlined today.
And I agree with you 100%. So, Mr. Fettus, by attempting to move us deeper into the Yucca Mountain fantasy land, do you think this discussion draft brings us further away from a permanent storage solution for nuclear waste that would actually, than that which would allow us to actually move waste out of these closed plant sites?
Yes. In fact, I would suggest, Senator, and I appreciate this line of questioning, that the outline of the concepts that I have in my testimony today would potentially get us farther, faster than the 2048 deadline that the Energy Department has been bandying about for several years.
Okay, so the NRC has refused to answer my questions about whether the Commonwealth or surrounding towns might be left footing the bill for decommissioning costs like storage if the licensee can't pay. Mr. Fettus, what could it mean for costs to the town or to taxpayers if we don't develop a real plan to address nuclear waste storage?
I think those costs could be significant, and if anything were to ever go wrong, they could be astronomical.
They could be astronomical. Mr. Fettus, have the towns and taxpayers in the Commonwealth provided consent to have nuclear waste stored indefinitely in their hometown?
Not that I'm aware of.
No, it's a decision made by the federal government. We don't want every decommissioned nuclear site to become a permanent repository for radioactive waste. We don't want to be left holding an ongoing endless bill for storage costs, emergency response costs, and radiological monitoring costs, continuing to pretend as though Yucca Mountain is a real, viable option for the permanent storage of nuclear waste from Massachusetts and every other community where this type of waste currently resides, only makes it more likely that it will be these communities which will be left holding radioactive receipts. We need a real, honest dialogue about nuclear waste storage, and that conversation won't lead us to Yucca Mountain. And moreover, and this will be my final question, if I may, Mr. Chairman. This discussion draft pursues the development of interim nuclear waste storage sites, which leads to two dangerous potential outcomes. First, if we don't get a real long-term solution, the interim sites could become de facto permanent repositories, an unacceptable outcome. And second, if we do eventually develop a permanent repository, interim storage means we'll have to move dangerous radioactive waste twice. That's twice as much risk that something could go wrong along the way. Mr. Fettis, do you think that transportation and safety issues should be considered as part of any nuclear waste management plan?
Yes.
And do you think that communities that might be exposed to a transportation-related nuclear waste accident should be consulted as part of a consent-based nuclear waste management process?
Absolutely.
Otherwise, twice we'll be putting mobile Chernobyls out on the highways of America, driving nuclear waste across our country through communities that will not have been given consent and without proper security that has been put in place. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.